morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the New Energy Advancement Hub. My name is Tatiana Mitrova. I'm Research Fellow at Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University and Director of the New Energy Advancement Hub. And today we are going to discuss the challenges and opportunities faced by oil-producing countries and oil companies in the era of climate change and energy transition. And I'm so happy to introduce our guest speaker, Adi Imsirovic, who is director at Surrey Clean Energy and senior associate at CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Adi has enormous experience in oil trading, 35 years, correct? And Adi has written a huge number of papers and articles on this topic of oil and gas prices, benchmarks, and energy security. He is the author of the book, Trading and Price Discovery for Crude Oil Growth and Development of International Oil Markets, and another book on Brent crude oil genesis and development of the world's most important oil benchmark, published a year ago, I assume. And now I know he's working on another book on oil companies and energy transition, but no spoilers. Adi, welcome. Let's discuss oil and energy transition. Really intriguing question.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot. So let's move ahead. So first of all, why do you think it is important to understand the historical trends in the oil market and how it helps to navigate the current market dynamics in the era of energy transition?
Right. Well, we all learn from history, hopefully, even though people tend to have rather short memories sometimes. But it goes back to my first book that you mentioned, is Trading and Price Discovery for Crude Oils. Actually, the first half of that book is basically a story of the oil industry from the perspective of oil markets and market power. And that really helped me kind of put into perspective what are the important things in markets. Obviously, I always look at the oil industry from the perspective of the markets, because for 35 years I was an oil trader. Came into trading from academia. Now, kind of having retired from trading, I'm sort of back in academia, having rather good time, quite enjoying it actually, with having no pressures of everyday oil trading and marrying positions. So anyway, but and as we all know, prices are virtually impossible to predict. Like, well, where's the oil price tomorrow? Even though that was our job, but interestingly enough, long-term oil prices are not that hard to predict because they're a function of market structure. And that's what the first half of the book is pretty much all about. So whenever you have market power, you obviously have that power decides what the market should be. So the very early days of the oil industry, we had perfectly competitive markets where the prices were extremely volatile. But they were determined by the markets, they're determined by investors, speculators, and so on. Later on, obviously, we all know came the monopoly of Rockefeller, and prices were very, very stable. So whenever we have these controlled markets, we have stability of oil prices. And I know some people very much crave about that stability, but it's not a competitive market structure quality of the competitive market. So we can talk about that maybe a little bit later, because it's a really interesting point, because some people lately have been talking about, oh, well, we should have somebody who really controls the market. But before we get to that, then we had probably the greatest oligopoly of all times, the oligopoly of Seven Sisters, and we had very stable prices again. Just like Rockefeller, they were low because they were buying from producing countries. They obviously didn't want to pay the royalties too high. And later on, with advent of OPEC, actually prices became a lot more volatile, and that's because OPEC hasn't really been able to control the market. OPEC only controls a small fraction of the market, 25 to 30% of the market. And even though OPEC is a very big player, and as we call it in the industry, elephant in the room, that should not be ignored, even though OPEC does impact prices, it's not controlling prices. So I think having this sort of basic background to the markets is quite important to sort of understand, where we are going and what will impact the prices, if not day-to-day basis, then at least longer term ones.
So speaking about this question, where are we going? What are the expectations from the governments, from the industry, from the international organizations, from the policies to facilitate the transition of oil companies? What is going to happen with them? What's point B in this
Yeah, boy, these
destination?
are, Tatiana, you're asking some very, very big questions here. We could spend a whole day just on that subject. I mean, essentially, as an energy economist, the way I see the energy markets, you've got government involvement in the market is twofold. Sometimes it's very, very positive and very good, and sometimes it's totally misguided. So let's start with good policies. We have another elephant in the room. This time in today we have a green elephant in the room, and that's the elephant of climate change, which is definitely going to mark the modern era of energy markets. It's the most important issue in the energy markets, if not overall, politically and geopolitically. Climate change is an externality, and it's usually referred to as a market failure. But I don't like that term, even though I will continue using it because most people use it. I'll tell you just why I don't like it. Well, you need to have a market in the first place to fail. But here we never had any markets. So, market failure somehow implies that we had some markets and they didn't work. Well, we never had them. For market externalities, generally pollution, we don't have markets. We don't have markets for clean air. We don't have markets for stable climate. So that's a region where that's a sort of area where governments really have to get involved. And the way they should get involved is basically so we call, as economists call it, internalizing these externalities, i.e., in very simple English, apply the basic rule that polluter pays. So if somebody's polluting, they really have to pay for cleaning it up. And if they don't, we've got market failure and that sort of situation. The other one that's very obvious as well these days is security. Security is a public, what we call in economics, public good. So everyone in the nation benefits from energy security. So there is a reason for government to intervene to provide that energy security as well. So I think these are two examples of very, very good government intervention. But we also have loads of examples, and especially now linking to your first question, that we learn from a lot of examples of bad market intervention. So I'll start with history first, and I'll say why it's relevant. So a lot of people, if you remember, you're probably too young to remember, but in 1973, in the US, we had energy crises where there were queues at petrol stations or gas stations, that they would say, and there were shortages as well. But I would argue, and I argue in my first book without going into detailed arguments here, I argue that it was basically failure of the government policy. Namely, Nixon administration introduced price freezes. Now, and you don't have to be an oil person to understand that refineries can't just switch between producing gas oil and gasoline because there's certain cuts in sort of a crude unit. So what tends to happen is to supply enough gasoline in the summer and distillate products in the winter, we need to store that oil, okay, over time. And in order to store it, we need incentives. And incentives are prices in future being higher than prices now, what we call in trading contango situation. Now, if you freeze prices, overall, nobody will store anything because storage is just expensive. It doesn't bring you any revenue. So that's exactly what happened. They froze the prices. When you freeze prices, people simply don't store enough. Comes the summer, not enough gasoline. You've got shortages. Now, why do I say that now? Well, we only recently, you know very well that we had European Union putting caps on TTF and all the other gas hubs in Europe. I thought it was very, very scary. They even thought about it. Now, fortunately, some sanity prevailed somewhere and they put those caps at very high level. So they never kicked in really. But there is that mentality of capping prices, of reducing prices, which is extremely dangerous because what tends to happen is that when you have cap prices, there's no incentive for other producers to produce more. And there's no incentive for people to reduce waste. Those people who actually don't particularly need the product may be still saying, well, why not? I mean, it's cheap enough and we do it. And there's so many other examples. I would just mention one more, which is very, very important. For a period of time during the energy crisis following the Ukrainian war, what happened was a number of European politicians were talking about electricity prices being too high because they were reflecting the price of generation from gas. Okay? And they were saying, well, look, we have all these renewables that actually sometimes produce at negative prices. This is all wrong. We have to change this. They should actually reflect average prices rather than marginal prices. And of course, all these things happen from people who never did any economics because marginal pricing is the essence of economics. The thing is that marginal price of electricity comes from gas because that's what we call spinning capacity that produces the last megawatt that's needed in the market. So if you don't give the gas producers that price, they won't produce, and then you'll have shortages. And this is like basic 101 economics that our dear leaders very often fail miserably and actually cause fundamental problems in the economy. So, coming sort of from government point of view, I think that would be the most important thing to say, that we've seen a lot more intervention by governments in the markets. But I think that intervention really, we have to be very careful how much we allow government to do it because they may well mess it up at some stage. That's my fear.
Well, Adi, coming from a centralized economy, I understand pretty well how deficits can be handmade, yeah, and how it works. And basically, I'm also a bit scared of this increased role of the governments in the energy industry and this prescriptive decision making. So, what do you think when we are talking, when we are looking ahead? About the transformation of the oil industry specifically, let's say sustainable fuels, for
Mhm.
example. Do you expect that governments will also prescribe and regulate prices and introduce some caps? Do they have this temptation, or do they realize that marginal pricing is absolutely the must if you want anything to happen?
Well, I have my theory. I think the reason politicians tend to get involved in prices because that gives them power in
Yeah.
terms of their constituency, in terms of lobbying, and so on. So they are suddenly important because everyone, all the industry and everyone around them is like, hey, hang on, well, let's talk. We like you. We need you. We want to talk to you. Whereas they tend not to get involved in things where should get involved, such as internalizing externalities, in introducing carbon tax. United States being the most obvious example at a federal level. No even mention of carbon tax, which every economist knows it's absolute necessity for fighting climate change. It's not the solution, it's not a silver bullet, but without it, we can't move anywhere. We can elaborate on that later on why and how. But essentially, so they tend to get involved in things that are easier, but gives them more power, and not to get involved in with things that are harder and actually could be a bit of a lost cause. They could lose votes and so on and so forth. So that's kind of my simple take on that. I think I might have lost a little bit of the thread of your question, but you can remind me at any
No,
point.
no. That was pretty good and clear. And well, I share your skepticism and your fears. But what do you think if we look back at the challenges facing oil industry. It's really a very difficult moment for the decision makers in the business, whether to invest or not. If
Mm.
you are investing, are you putting your money on upstream, on drilling,
Yeah.
or on your refineries modernization, switching to the biofuels or whatever? Which geographies do you choose? How do you structure? Or maybe you switch completely to the green energy, as certain oil and gas companies are trying to do. So, how do you think the policies, the governmental policies, and the market drivers are affecting this decision making? I'm
Mm.
talking about governmental policies, first of all, but also the influence of carbon markets and influence of LNG development. So it's a very complex picture,
Mm.
this environment for decision making in the oil companies. What do you think are the key drivers here?
Well, I was at a forum in Washington last week, and one thing you hear from the industry is like, give us stability and predictability. Even
You just mentioned that stability and predictability is a sign of monopoly.
well, there is another way of doing well, what I mean, predictability and stability of policy. That's the problem. I'll give you one very good example. In the UK here, we had basically a ban on ICE vehicles or internal combustion engine vehicles by 2030. Okay. And then suddenly the Tory government, the current prime minister, decided he wanted to move it to 2035. And I just happened to kind of be partly in the loop, somehow involved. I know for certain that the auto industry was against moving into 35. Auto industry,
Wow.
because they already made all their plans for 2030. Everything was in place. Civil service, government civil service was against it completely. All the sort of mandarins of the sort of political establishment said, no, it's a bad decision. Well, the prime minister did it anyway. Okay, and the reason is just to score some cheap political points, and that's one of the problems we have with sort of modern democracies, that when people are elected for 4 to 5 years at a time, then you have these policy swings all over the place. And the industry, it's extremely hard. Imagine auto industries now investing all the money into plants and machinery for example, for EV production, and now you get a new president in the United States, or you get a new prime minister, and nobody knows what's going to happen next. So, and this is the main reason why very often, and this is a great thing that you said about companies, companies are very often backtracking, and they're saying, well, maybe you look at BP and Shell now, they say, well, maybe we shouldn't be making this transition as fast as we should. And every time I see that, every time I see companies going back on the energy transition, I just see it as a policy failure. It's a policy failure. It's never a company failure. Companies, it's role of the government to set a level playing field for everyone. Even if you read, if in writing my latest book, obviously read a lot of stuff, and then I was reading all the environmental stuff that ExxonMobil wrote in the last few years, and they very clearly talk about carbon tax as the obvious solution. They want carbon tax. Companies want carbon tax because that gives them a level playing field. Now they know where they want to cut, how they're going to cut it. And if without carbon tax, you don't have a tool to evaluate, to make policy decisions. Is a project A better than project B? Well, how do you know if you don't have a value on that saved carbon? You don't. And that's very often an issue, Tatiana. I'm sure you know that a lot of environmentalists don't get. A lot of environmentalist groups out there, they go like, oh, no, no, carbon tax is just an excuse for the rich to continue polluting. It's not. The rich are smarter than that. If they don't have to pay, they won't pay. Okay. They don't like paying. That's why they're rich. Okay. So
Well, that's their nature. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's an absolute beginning, and I think companies see it that way. But whenever they backtrack, it's usually a result of government policy failure, either to nudge them enough or to give them the means. And the government role, obviously, here we can discuss it, for a long, long time if you wish, but it's not just to set, the carbon tax and levels of carbon tax, but also to provide so many other things. We're talking about necessary financing because obviously transition will need it, to also provide necessary infrastructure. You can't, there's no point producing cars if you don't have a road. There's no point having EVs if you don't have chargers and so on. So these are all things that come sort of hand in hand with energy transition. So I actually feel it for the companies. I think companies are in a very, very difficult situation right now, especially the European majors, oil and gas majors, because they have to compete. I discussed this last week, and it was great. It's always refreshing to go to the US because you get completely different perspective, right? And I'm saying, like, it's really hard to be BP or Shell because they are competing with ExxonMobil and Chevron, but they don't have the set. They have much, much higher pressures than these guys. And interesting thing is that, again, sort of sometimes, well, not sometimes, very often, I do criticize environmentalists because they don't see the right picture. I consider myself environmental, but not sort of to the extreme where you can press BP or Shell to the point where simply in competing with these guys, they're in a situation where they're making a lot lower profits. And imagine next thing you see is ExxonMobil buying BP. And what have you achieved then? You've achieved absolutely nothing, years of trouble, and you've got nothing. And that's unfortunately how capitalism works. And you have to accept the rules of the road. And there's nothing wrong with capitalism. We can solve the problem and we know all the solutions. We just have to actually apply them. They're not always very palatable. And I could, sorry, just one more thing that I would just slightly add, and you can, if you wish, we can elaborate on that. The problem with energy transition is that it's going to be very expensive. And fossil fuel industry is basically advertising that fact very, very loudly, and politicians are keeping rather quiet about it. But I don't think anyone underlines the fact that not doing anything about climate is far more expensive. So in writing my latest book, I've done a number of various papers on costs of social cost of climate change and so on, and virtually all the reputable recent papers easily point out that the sooner we do it, the better, the cheaper. So I would always argue for the case of going for the energy transition ASAP, not because of some ethical normative views, but because it's cheaper. It's cash. Let's do it because it's going to be a lot cheaper, guys.
Yeah, just recently I found a very interesting comparison made by IEA of the IRRs of solar power plants
Mhm.
and of the gas-fired power plants, not in Europe, not in the US, not in the locations which have IRA or any other green plants, but like in Brazil, in Africa, in Argentina, so countries which do not have such massive support schemes, but basically IRRs were very close already. So in terms of money, it is already competitive. Yeah, and this is the reason for the companies, for the businesses to invest. Okay, when you see your profit, here you go. And at the same time, I really loved your expression, green elephant in the room. Yeah, something that the businesses are not yet talking seriously about. I have an impression that they really do not realize how massive climate damage could be for them, and that
Yep.
not spending now for mitigation, they will have to spend like 5 times more for adaptation measures. And by the way, this was my pre-prepared question to you. Do you see in the strategies of the oil companies any clear understanding of their adaptation policies, strategies, or plans. Are they working on it at all?
I don't think so. I'm afraid to say, not the research that I have done. I haven't seen enough of that. I think everyone is kind of assuming that climate change is going to mean, let's say, 2% or 2.5%. We are now going for about 2.5% with current policies, that it's just going to be a little bit warmer. But when you look at situation in Africa, Kenya, Afghanistan, last year, Pakistan, floods, it's just, and nobody is putting price on that. And by the way, let me just take one step back. I just what is not enough talked about is the fact that if governments like the federal government in the United States don't put a price on carbon through some sort of whatever they call it, they can call it inflation reduction of carbon or something. It doesn't really matter, but it will happen in one of two ways. It will happen either through insurance, because insurance are just backing off. I mean, you try and insure a house in certain places in Florida in the next 10 years, so you'll see the cost. And then the other one is litigation. And I think that's going to drive the whole thing as well. So I think at the moment it's just, there's a lot of I don't know what even to call it. Like, people are burying their heads in the sand and saying, well, somehow he's going to blow away, or maybe I'll just be CEO for another 4 years and it will just kind of all disappear. I don't think most governments, most companies are prepared for this.
But then if we put aside the governmental policies, yeah, we understand that they are not sufficient, that they are not focused enough, but okay, it's one part. But on the corporate policies and strategies, is there anything really driving the appetite of oil companies in moving faster into energy transition? Do they see there any opportunities, benefits, profits, or different positioning, access to the different markets, something attractive?
It's okay. I think a lot of them are hoping that oil will go through the phase that coal went through. A lot of people backing off, not enough investment, oil prices going up, and Glencore and the likes making a fortune. Okay, so they hope for that, and there's been a lot of talk, and I'm sure you're aware of a number of my colleagues, analysts, some very big names out there, who are talking about another price spike as a result of lack of investment, or what people tend to call super cycle.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't buy that idea in case of oil at all, because I think I think oil is coming to the stage where oil's always had a monopoly in transportation sector, and will probably continue to do so for airline industry for quite some time. Shipping, probably not so much, but the bulk of it anyway, most of it was road transportation. And you know what, Tatiana, we have options now. I mean, it's EVs are close to parity with ICE vehicles. If we didn't have all these taxes on import duties on Chinese vehicles and bans, there would be
And
even
the new
cheaper.
ones recently approved.
Absolutely. That would be even cheaper. And a lot of people at this stage are still buying EVs as a second car and then keep an ICE and an EV, which is understandable. People have a lot of common sense. But I mean, if you were running a business, if you needed a car and you were worried about geopolitics and impact of geopolitics on oil prices, well, you do have an option. It's not, insurmountable. So in my opinion, that's really going to weaken this sort of price, the ability of sort of oil as a commodity to cause these price shocks. And that's obviously because of the price elasticity of demand. What happens now, you see every time, oil prices go up, demand falls. So we're actually seeing that, because also biofuels are eating into demand, especially demand for distillates. it was incredible when you have right incentives, and governments have given right incentives for alternative fuels or biofuels, for especially for airline industry. Suddenly, we've had a boom in supply, and markets work. Incentives work, and we do have solutions if we just want to have the right government policy. So, it's policy, policy, policy. And I have a bet with a couple of people in the industry, well-known people in the industry. I'm saying that past 2030, the demand will fall below last year's levels. I don't know if I'm right or wrong. In fact, I don't think anyone knows or can know, because it's a subject of policy. So
Exactly.
I don't know. I mean, if the right policies prevail, and my thinking, if there's common sense and right policies prevail, we will have a big fall in demand. And now we're going on to, again, back to your question. Well, if by 2030 we lose 5-6 million barrels of demand, boy, what are we talking about? The national, international oil companies, national oil companies, producers, the impact is going to be rather big.
Um, I have very difficult choice. I want to talk about this impact on the oil producing countries and companies, but I also want to ask you about another factor. You've mentioned briefly a factor defining the speed of transition. So you said policies, policies, and policies. I agree, it's really crucial. But what about technologies? I
Yeah.
mean, they
Yeah.
are also related to the policies, but do you expect anything? I mean, oil companies are struggling. So what is their choice basically at the moment? Yeah, either they switch away from oil to the green to solar to wind, where they basically do not have good competences, to be absolutely frank. Yeah, it's a different type of business, or they something that they love. It is a hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and CCUS. Yeah, because it sounds familiar. It's about reservoir engineering. It's about pipelines. So good old things. They are talking about combining it with direct air capture and other fancy stuff. Do they have anything? And biofuels, yeah, biofuels for sure. Do they have anything else for their choice, which would really make sense? Or is there any new technology coming which could really facilitate this transition for the big guys?
Yeah, well, that's a very clever question, because it's impossible to answer, and you've really already sort of mentioned quite a few technologies that I think are actually going to introduce some sort of white elephants in the room. But let's start slowly. I mean, initially, especially European companies came up with the clever idea, let's turn into energy companies. And I think, Equinor, Total, BP, and Shell were all sort of, BP was originally leader. We remember Beyond Petroleum, a couple of decades ago. They were just a little bit too early. That's a really good plan, but you're totally right about the competencies. I mean, how good are they, this sort of thing? And, transition, unfortunately, is also not being linear. Most people, somehow, it's our nature, I think, that we expect things to be linear. So, okay, we need a transition. So prices of renewables, if I invest money into renewables, it's going to go up and up and up. Well, it hasn't. A lot of people lost money, right? Because, it goes up and down, policies being the key, and so on and so forth. So what's left to all companies, this CCS, I call it CCS on purpose rather than CCUS, because I think U is just another white elephant. It's utilization of what? I mean, how much can carbon be utilized in the spot? Very little. It's just thrown in there as sort of by some PR guy, a clever PR guy. So it's basically CCS. CCS makes no money. It's hugely expensive and makes no money. And this is another reason why companies like ExxonMobil want to have a carbon tax. Without carbon tax, there's no CCS. You can have subsidy, which is an equivalent of a tax, but it's really interesting. I mean, US example again sort of is being interesting, that you can't, I mean, there's a limit to which governments can throw money at things, okay, especially when they're pretty hopeless. As an economist, my thinking is actually very similar to thinking of a farmer, maybe even a peasant. Okay, pick the low-hanging fruit. And low hanging fruit is like, let's cut methane emissions first. That's the obvious, easy one, cheap, in fact, profitable for the companies to do. Just make them do that. And you have a massive impact on the environment. No, you have IRA and you throw money at DAC or direct air capture. So of course, what happens as a result is what I tend to call subsidy farming. What happens? People farm subsidies, and you get Occidental and I think it's BlackRock throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at it. Why? Because they're going to make money at it from it. And I did ask last year at the FT, the conference in London. No, it wasn't FT. Sorry, it was it was energy conference by international. No, it was energy intelligence conference. And I asked the CEO of Oxy, well, how do you feel about taking all this money from the government for, doing this project, which is actually extremely inefficient. I mean, imagine how much a machine that runs on power can take carbon out of thin air while you are at the same time polluting for free. I don't think she appreciated the question very much. But this is the point is not Occidental or anyone else. It's just the general idea of not having carbon tax, but at the same time trying to make people, collect carbon from processes or even from thin air. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Okay. These are solutions that we'll probably have at the end of our energy transition. We'll need them. But at this stage, it's just a pie in the sky. It's just a story that the fossil fuel industry is coming up with in order to prolong their shelf life. Saying, look, we've got solutions. We'll just carry on. Just let us carry on. Give us plenty of money and we'll kind of somehow sort of manage it. Why? We have clean technologies. Why should we throw billions of dollars in these big plants at this stage of transition? Maybe at some later stage where we need to produce still kerosene, for example, for aircraft because we don't have a right substitute. Fine, then throw some money and that sort of 7 million barrels a day or fraction of that do CCS, and it will cost extra, but you know what? We have biofuels are expensive, so it will kind of equalize. The biofuels, fine, fair enough. But that's for a very small part of our energy transition. Very small, tiny part. At this stage, we've got much better things to do, much better solutions, both for power and for road transportation.
So with these much better solutions, what should reasonable oil company do? Yeah, so how should they approach? Should they, starting from their investment process, yeah, to invest or not to invest? They're sitting on money right now. They are making very good profits during the last few years. So they can just give it back to shareholders.
Which they're
Shareholders
doing. I
will
was
be
about to
happy.
say that's
Yeah.
what they're doing. The other one is there is one technology. I mean, it is not a modern technology anymore, but a really good play for oil companies is shale. It's an ideal play for energy transition. The reason is that first of all, you've got a limited time frame of the investment. So it's easier to find shale than it is something in deep water. You know where things are in Permian already. So you start fracking there for another year. You can spread the risk through because each well is probably $10 million rather than $10 billion. So you can have hundreds of them. So you spread your risk. You invest for a year ahead, not for another 10 years ahead, which brings uncertainty. Then from the risk management point of view, you can actually hedge that in futures markets. It's very hard to hedge large production, which you don't really have exact profile of 10, 15 years forward. You can do it for a year, no problem. So you've got money in the pocket. And that's why you have seen ExxonMobil doing what they're doing, Chevron doing what they're doing. They're going for sure plays that will bring them production for the next 5 years. They're going for sure thing. And that's an absolute right strategy. And at the same time, if they don't have some longer vision, and they're hoping maybe in between some new technology will come up and they will become energy companies. But at this stage, really what I see more and more is them just buying back their shares and giving money back to the shareholders. It's up to the shareholder to decide what they want to do with the money, which is fair enough.
And what about NOCs? So, okay, ExxonMobil and Chevron, they found their path. What about national oil companies and their oil producing countries themselves, which are so much reliant on these revenues, which do not have this short investment cycle shale? Yeah, so either they go to like deep, very expensive, deep offshore, yeah, or what else can they do? And how do they have any plan how to navigate in this energy transition?
Tatiana, I should be asking you, and I did ask you actually when I was writing my latest book. But anyway, I will give sort of a short summary of how I see it. I mean, there are lots of issues, I mean, to unpack here, as you know. The main shareholder is the government, so it's very much depends on what the governments want to do. Do they have any vision, right? The second question rather than answer is are they the right tools for energy transition? I would argue they're not, because and simply for a simple reason, because I can see what's happening with utilities in most countries, especially countries that have large monopoly utilities. Like developing countries would have one utility that's covers the whole country. Even in places like United Kingdom here, where I know a little bit more, utilities or at least sort of parts of the utilities, because they're broken up. So the ones that do transmission, for example, they are given by the government because the natural monopolies, they're given a certain return, let's say 5% per annum. If you've got 5% per annum return, what are your incentives? What are your incentives? You have no incentive to change. You're getting guaranteed return, no incentive to change. Your only incentive is actually to invest even more capital into what you already have, because you don't get 5% on more capital. So, I don't think they're right. And this is why we have very slow transition, especially in the power markets, where it shouldn't be, because as the utilities should realize that having wind and solar energy is much cheaper way of generating most of the power. Okay, but they don't do it. Why don't they do it? Why would they? They don't have
Yeah,
much. So
it's so complicated and
exactly, and then
difficult.
and then sort of I tend to look. I'm more interested in NOCs in oil producing countries. And it's interesting that there's now mixed role between NOCs and sovereign wealth funds. So there's this fluidity between them, and it's obviously coming from the governments. They seem to transfer funds quite effortlessly between them, and particularly UAE and Saudi Arabia have done a fairly good job in that. And I actually think, having done a lot of research and talked to people like yourself who know more about it than I do, it seems to me in Saudi Arabia, UAE, very good examples. I think that actually those two countries have gone a long further down the transition way than many people think. They are moving their economies towards service type economies. Yes, they have some white elephants, let's not name them, but they are making that transition by using this kind of relationship between government, sovereign wealth funds, and the national champions. So that's kind of working. What I'm really worried about are the producers, smaller producers. I don't know, like Venezuela's, Nigeria, Libya, Algeria. They don't have any significant wealth funds. They're totally reliant on oil. They haven't done nothing to diversify their economies. And you know what? If tomorrow, and they are most of them are high cost producers. So if tomorrow demand falls, and it will, otherwise we're all in trouble, it will fall by 5-10 million barrels a day. They are out of business. It's the Saudis and UAEs that will be still producing because they have very low production costs. They are out of business. They have economies. They have not been diversified. They've got no money to fall back on, literally no money in the bank. They'll be in big trouble. And that's why I wrote a piece for Petroleum Economist previous month. I actually think that, and I'm probably jumping ahead of what you might want to ask me. I think OPEC should completely change their role and actually focus on helping producers to actually bridge the energy transition. Because energy transition is inevitable. Climate change is there. We all know it. And instead of trying to sort of squeeze the last drop of the lemon and keep prices very high, which is only speeding up the energy transition, they should actually focus. They have excellent secretariat, excellent people. They should focus on helping their member countries make that energy transition before it's too late.
Wow, I really like this idea. I'm sorry I didn't see the article, but I think for me it sounds great because indeed they have very smart people and a lot of competence and good thinking inside the organization. And at the same time, but I mean, the contradiction that I see here is that OPEC from the very beginning. It was an alliance focused on basically revenue maximization for the
Mm.
members. Yeah, you may not call it cartel, though it was basically formed the way cartels
Well,
are formed.
after 83, 84, they were, they have been a cartel for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And the role that you are suggesting, it's more of a partnership to survive, basically. Yeah,
Yes.
when the stronger economies, the more advanced in energy transition countries, support the others in building this bridge. So it would be great if they would agree to do so. I'm just
Well,
not sure if they will see
well,
interest for themselves there.
Tatiana, is actually now it all really nicely ties up to your very first question. Why do we read history? And when I wrote my first book, basically at the end, I have a small piece at the end of OPEC chapter that's like says OPEC legacy. Okay. And a lot of people, and including OPEC, I was in the secretariat last year, and I probably won't be invited again. But
What
the
did you say?
well, I mean, I have been fairly critical. I mean, at the same time, basically my view in the book was, look, I think original OPEC legacy, the most important OPEC legacy, is takeover of the oil and gas wealth of their own countries from the oligopoly of Seven Sisters. And I think it's a really positive anti-colonial legacy that I never see OPEC advertise, which is crazy because it's such a positive thing that they should be celebrating. And they don't. I don't know why. I have no idea. So that's number one. So there is some positive legacy they should focus on and say, look, this is what we did. It was a great thing. And it really was indeed a great thing. And now we've got another one that we can actually make a great thing because we are at that turning point where we can say, look, how can we help our members cash in the money that we've enjoyed for the last 65 years and now actually make something out of it? So I don't think it's not that far-fetched. Obviously, it takes a huge political will. And I think the problem is that the leading countries seem to have within the organization or cartel or whatever you want to call it, the leading countries want to see as high oil prices for as long as possible, while at the same time actually conducting energy transition. And it suits them because they just get more revenues. But what happens to smaller members? I don't know. So in that respect, I don't think OPEC is doing the right thing at the moment. I think they can do a lot better and have a much better and positive legacy for themselves and for the world.
I would agree, yeah. I didn't think from this perspective, but when you are saying it, I understand that you are right. Indeed. So the strategy of maximizing prices, actually, well, 99.99. That's the target price, as one OPEC member said. So I think it's correct, but at the same time, and they will be the last man standing
Yes,
anyway with the lowest production costs. But at the same time, for the other members, it's really going to be a disaster. And I mean, when I'm trying to put it all together in my head, the geopolitical challenges and all this massive destabilization which we are observing worldwide, the demand transformation and this prospect of rather sharp demand decline. We don't know when it will start, but we see already that is
yes,
approaching. Yeah, and then these problems with the failed states, they will become at a certain
absolutely.
point, together with the climate change, yeah, with our green elephant in the room. Yeah, and all these floodings and disasters, it looks like a apocalypse tomorrow. Yeah, so a really, really challenging picture. But I want to close the loop and come back to the very starting point of oil benchmarks. Yeah. So, in this changing world, in the world of energy transition, and transition, it's a process, not destination. Yeah. So, in this transition, what is the role of oil benchmarks?
Right. Well, if I had to give you one word, that would be massive. Virtually all the oil in the world is priced at benchmarks, and benchmarks have made an incredibly important role in reducing opaqueness and introducing transparency in the oil market. Transparency and fairness, because if I buy some oil from you and we price it at a fair benchmark, we are both happy that a week later that we'll get a fair price, which is very important. And of course, in that sort of Brent benchmark, and I spent sort of second book that I mentioned it's really interesting because I edited that book. I got some old hands that were in the heyday of the sort of emergence of Brent as a global benchmark. So we wrote, I wrote 3 chapters, and I've got another 6 chapters in there of various aspects of the trading of Brent. But anyway, going back to price itself is a message, and very often I say don't shoot the messages. Going back again to the idea of TTF being capped. Well, you're shooting the messenger. It's nothing to do with TTF. It's to do with underlying fundamentals. And as long as these benchmarks, WTI, Brent, Dubai, in terms of oil, in terms of gas, is Henry Hub equivalents, basically Henry Hub, TTF, and JKM in Asia. As long as the benchmarks do their function, I think there's a good chance that markets will continue to function. And we can see now, I mean, last week I was actually asked one of the questions. Well, look, there was this Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's a lot of massive government intervention. We've got energy transition. How are the market's coping? And I'm like, amazingly well. Amazingly well.
True.
Honestly, even as an old oil trader, I'm thinking like, wow, look, the markets are doing fine, just fine. Just kind of don't mess with them kind of thing, right? Well, what is going to happen? So, the role is important. I think benchmarks will remain extremely important as long as we leave them alone. I think that the key that's going to happen in future is the green elephant is going to influence them. So what will happen is that, the carbon content of various types of crude oil is going to be extremely important. And that's something that, again, that I don't see, because we don't have carbon tax everywhere else, I don't see oil producers advertise. For example, carbon content of Saudi production is relatively low. I just don't understand why they don't advertise it a lot more. And they say, hey, look, our oil is produced in a relatively clean way compared to many, many others. It's a huge thing. Now, of course, as you know very well, CBAM hopefully will sort that problem out. And I'd like to see something done in the States, even though how you get an equivalent of a CBAM without internal federal carbon tax, I have no idea. I don't think you can, but they probably will. So So I think what we'll see next is this carbon content playing far more important role in terms of oil price. So I think people will want to see what that crude is value subject to the carbon it has inside it.
So does it mean like a new benchmark?
There may well be a new benchmark, and I think I wrote a paper about it last year, actually early last year, and I talk about it in my new book a little bit more, not a little bit more, a lot more. And it's also going to come to China. This is the most exciting part. And now we're talking a little bit about future of the markets, or oil markets at least, oil and gas markets. I think it's going to come in a very interesting way because we have fantastic technology that's absolutely perfect for that sort of thing. And it's not just giving us very volatile Bitcoin. It's actually blockchain technology. So blockchain is absolutely fabulous one where you can actually have a cargo of oil arrive to the refinery, and on a, let's say, a QR code that you can scan with your phone, you can get the whole history of where it came from, on what ship, who resold it, at what price, or whatever information is you are allowed to get or you are interested in. You can have women's participation in the production process if that's what you're interested in, child labor involvement, all that information at a fingerprint, easily provided. So I think that's probably the way the markets will go. And that kind of technologies allow us to set the right price, and that in a marketplace, you are buying what you want to buy with certain attributes. So it doesn't always have to be just sulfur content and API. Now it will be carbon, or it may be something completely different, some other attribute that you want associated with that crude oil. For example, quality vessels. You want oil to arrive on quality vessel. All of that can be part of a digital technology is coming towards us, and I'm really looking forward to being a part of it.
Wow, that sounds really inspiring. Adi, thank you so much. I think we've managed to cover a lot of exciting issues, and I agree. I would love to spend another uh, day discussing each of them, but I think we have to ramp up. So thank you so much for all your insights and very interesting views. Sometimes, as I said, just eye-opening views. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for being with us today.
It's always a pleasure talking to you, Tatiana. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.